Welcome to this afternoon's lecture concert covering the mid and late career of Ludwig van Beethoven, the years 1804 to 1827. In our June 2020 lecture, we covered the first 30 years of Beethoven's life from his childhood in Bonn, Germany, then as a young pianist in Vienna, playing, conducting, and composing with great success, even premiering his cello sonata in a private concert for the King of Prussia. The early achievements signaled a brilliant career ahead. Joining me today is pianist Mark Salmon, who is already well known to VCA audiences. Mark is a graduate of Juilliard and studied at MIT, where he met his lovely wife, Sarah. Mark is known throughout the Pacific Northwest for his performances of Beethoven, Liszt, and Chopin. Joining Mark today is his son and cellist, Jonathan Salmon. Jonathan is pursuing his performance degree at the New England Conservatory of Music. This past August last year, Mark and Jonathan played an all-Beethoven program, including 2 piano sonatas, the Waldstein and the Appassionata, plus Beethoven's 3rd cello sonata. If you missed the live stream of this performance last year, it is archived on VCA's website. Welcome, Mark, Jonathan, and Sarah. So glad to see you all here again. Today we cover Beethoven's mid and late years in Vienna, when he was 34 years old until his death at 57 in 1827. For the next 90 minutes, we will watch and listen to live performances of Beethoven's works, along with a look at the political world around him during the first quarter of the 19th century, a period marked by increasing deafness and isolation for Beethoven. Overshadowing Beethoven's brilliant career were the tumultuous political events that would soon engulf all of Europe in nearly 20 years of constant war. In May 1789, the French Revolution ended the Bourbon dynasty and replaced the monarchy with an elected assembly. Beethoven was very sympathetic to the ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity, which of course culminates in his setting of Schiller's Ode to Joy and the final choral movement of the Ninth Symphony. However, the noble ideals of the French Republic were quickly replaced in a coup by Napoleon Bonaparte, who in December 1805 ultimately crowns himself Emperor of France, with Pope Pius VII looking on. And you see this in this famous painting by David, which is hanging in the Louvre. By 1810, Napoleon marries the Austrian Archduchess Marie Lodovica, the daughter of the Habsburg Emperor. The hopes of a democratic republic model spreading from France to the rest of Europe were dashed. By the time Napoleon is crowned emperor, he indeed rules over a massive empire, as we see in this map of Europe in 1808. The blue area is what is ruled by Napoleon, or his siblings, nephews, relatives. Throughout Europe, Napoleon installed his family as kings, princes, and dukes, but probably the most contentious of these invasions was in Spain. This was total war, where invading troops ravaged the food and supplies of the local countryside, leaving civilians to certain starvation. Worst was when a country lost to Napoleon, its young men were conscripted into his armies. This painting is of a cavalry charge painted by Francisco Goya, the very famous French late 18th century painter. Goya was a contemporary of Beethoven, and also like Beethoven, lost his hearing by the age of 40, adding to his seclusion and depression as the war raged throughout Spain. The carnage of the Napoleonic Wars is hard for us to fathom. It is estimated that nearly 5% of Europe's population was lost in battle, injuries, famine, and disease. That's roughly 7 million deaths in a population back then in 1815 of 170 million people. An equivalent percentage loss of life for the US population today, to put in perspective, would be 15 million deaths. It is staggering to consider that Beethoven could still create throughout this devastating turmoil. The tortured paintings and etchings of Goya's last years reflect the horrors of this turbulent period. Like the music of Beethoven, these paintings are more than art. They are political statements. As to underline his protest, Goya chose voluntary exile from the repressive regime of the traitor king Fernando VII, his old protector. Goya was not alone in his hatred of the Spanish monarch. Beethoven also refused to send his works to Fernando. Beethoven originally intended for his Third Symphony, which was started a few years before Napoleon's coronation, and he had originally dedicated it to Napoleon. This symphony now is known as the Eroica. But as we see from this preserved original title page, Beethoven literally tore out Napoleon's name, proof of his utter contempt for the man who ruined hope for enlightenment. When Napoleon is finally defeated in 1815 at Waterloo, the old powers divide up Europe and try to set politics back to the monarchies as before the French Revolution. The 1815 Congress of Vienna, which we see here in this etching cartoon, reinstates the rule of the Bourbons in France and Spain, and the rest of the powers divide up Italy among Austria, Spain, and the papacy. Liberty, equality, and democratic policies were banned. The big change from the pre-Napoleonic era was the end of the Holy Roman Empire, as we now see in this map of Europe post-1815. There's the fledgling German state. There is the neutral Switzerland. However, Italy, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Belgium, Hungary, the Baltic, and the Balkan states were still ruled by foreign powers. It was obvious to enlightened thinkers like Beethoven that political and social progress stopped, and instead, reactionary regimes with repressive policies dominated Europe for almost 100 years. During this period, Beethoven was facing growing deafness. But by his late 30s, his lucrative career as a solo pianist and conductor ended. Isolated, alone, and already prone to depression, Beethoven wrote out his last testament and will while summering in a small town outside Vienna called Heiligenstadt. In what is now known as the Heiligenstadt Testament, Beethoven declared he would overcome despair and continue in pursuit of his art. We see here the first page of the Testament, which Beethoven kept among his personal papers for the rest of his life. I quote now a few passages from it. Quote, "I, repulsed by the sad experience of my bad hearing, and yet it was impossible for me to say to men, 'Speak louder, shout, for I am deaf.' An infirmity in one sense more perfect in me than in others, a sense which I once possessed in the highest perfection, a perfection such as few surely in my profession enjoy or have enjoyed. For me, there can be no recreations in society with fellows, in refined intercourse, in mutual exchange of thought. I must live in exile." Later in the Testament, he writes, "Such incidents brought me to the verge of despair. But little more, and I would have ended my life. Only art held me back. Ah, it seemed impossible to leave the world until I had produced all that I felt called upon to create, end of quote. This decision to persevere blessed future generations of music lovers with his great genius. The first composition we hear tonight is the 30th Piano Sonata, Opus 1 and 9, dedicated to Maximilia Brentano, the daughter of Antonin Brentano. Here we see the portrait of Antonin Brentano. Beethoven lived in the same spacious Vienna apartment for about a year with Antonie and her daughter. Antonie is the first of 3 women in Beethoven's later years who are speculated to be his, quote, the beloved. He wrote amazing love letters, never naming the person, but just saying, my beloved. And these letters are incredibly beautiful written. It can bring you to tears. Now, the Piano Sonata, Opus 30, 109, is written in 3 movements. The last movement is a set of variations, actually 6 variations. And I would like to say that each variation is a further step to bliss. Mark, please, could you come up and introduce us to this great sonata?
So this sonata, Opus 109, is this sort of set of the last 3 that Beethoven wrote. This is quite late in his career. It is from the written mostly in the year 1820, and this was at the point in his life when he was basically functionally fully deaf. All of his middle period pieces before this were kind of infused with the spirit that came after the Heiligenstadt Testament that Michael just mentioned, where that personal crisis, Beethoven kind of subsumed that into this incredible burst of creativity and wrote all those great middle period pieces, the Fifth Symphony, the Eroica Symphony, and all of those that have this incredible heroic energy, like that almost anything can be overcome. But as this sort of deafness progressed and overtook his entire life and eventually totally stopped his public performing career and conducting career and everything, and took all of this from him, that sort of feeling inside of him that anything can be overcome if with his sheer force of will just didn't cut it anymore. He had to basically come to terms with the fact that he had lost this faculty. And the music, for a few years, he almost didn't write anything very, very much at all. And then he wrote at a very, very slow pace, kind of like feeling his way into his new style. This new late style has a feeling of sort of an inner peace and tranquility, a sort of feeling of acceptance. There's this great lyricism to the music now. Often things are very, very compact, and things happen on a very, very short time scale. The music is very, very detailed and full of it's very, very intimate. Like he wasn't writing it for a public. It's almost like you listen to it and you're listening in on Beethoven's, most inner thoughts. And certainly the first movement of this sonata reflects that very, very, very much. For a sonata form movement, it's really, really quite short, and all the sections come just right after each other. What would normally have taken him an 8 or 10 minute movement 10 years before, he now puts it into maybe 2.5 or 3 minutes. The second movement is sort of a stormy struggle movement, but it's a different kind of struggle than you have in like a lot of the earlier sonatas, where there's that feeling that things are going to kind of turn out in the end. This one has this sort of sense of a little bit like that there's a certain sense of futility to it. He's going through the motions, because you have to struggle in the day-to-day life, but it isn't going to turn out exactly the way that he wants to. And that final movement that Michael just mentioned is that sort of feeling of, where do we go from here? Where is the acceptance? And it begins with this very, very beautiful and simple hymn theme. Each variation kind of explores some aspect that is sort of pregnant, that hymn theme is pregnant with. There might be like a suggestion of joy in one place. There might be a little suggestion of humor in another place. There might be a suggestion of something else. And each one of the variations kind of amplifies something that's there and makes it really, really quite overt. Until the final variation, he almost like what can I say, almost turns the theme inside out, where the theme starts out as this incredibly, as I say, intimate and introverted kind of hymn, and then it becomes, I won't say extroverted, but sort of sparkling and throwing notes all over the piano, and becomes this incredibly virtuosic and difficult thing. All these other figurations that are not even part of the theme, or like things that develop from part of the theme, become developed at a greater degree, and it doesn't even resemble the theme at all. But going through the entire variation is the notes on the upper register of the piano of the hymn theme. And then the piece ends with a sort of iteration of the hymn theme, except it's almost identical to the first iteration of it, except now, because we've gone through all of this, the feeling of it is entirely transformed.
Thank you, Mark. Oh, my word. Every time I hear that last movement, I just come to tears. It's one of the most beautiful, beautiful moments. And there's so many of them with Beethoven. Thank you, Mark. The next work we hear is Beethoven's Fourth Cello Sonata that is dedicated to Countess Marie van der Derde, pictured here. Marie was Hungarian royalty with financial resources and political clout. She was instrumental in Beethoven receiving an annual annuity of about $40,000 a year, funded by a few princes and archdukes. Countess van der Derde is the second candidate for Beethoven's beloved. The cello-piano genre in music started with Beethoven. Johann Sebastian Bach had written solo cello works, but Beethoven was the first to marry the cello with piano. As expected, the piano part in these pieces is on par to his concertos and sonatas in difficulty. However, unlike in his concertos and sonatas, where the piano premieres as the soloist, here the cello sonatas, the piano is neither an accompanist or soloist, but instead a partner in dialogue with the cellist. Mark, could you please introduce us to the Fourth Cello Sonata of Beethoven? This is Opus 111, written in 1822, dedicated to Archduke Rudolph. I'm sorry, I skipped a slide. That is not, here it is. It's Opus 4, Opus 102, written in 1815, dedicated to Marie van der Derde. First movement is Andante, second movement, Adagio. Sorry for that slip up.
Yeah, as Michael just said, this sonata was written in 1815, so several years before the Opus 109. And these particular two cello sonatas, I think, have a very, very significant place in Beethoven's works. As I was mentioning before, there was that change that came over his works, and it happened right from the early 18 teens, and from the heroic period to his late period. And these two cello sonatas of Opus 102 are the first pieces that really show his late style. And so in them, among the things that we get here are all the movements kind of run together. There's a first movement that's an andante, then it's followed by an allegro that runs right into it. And then there is a pause, and then there is an adagio, and then another allegro that follows that. Both of the adagio and the andante movements are very, very concentrated and intimate and almost improvisatory, like a sort of a stream of consciousness of whatever feelings and ideas that come over Beethoven at the moment. So as we were rehearsing this piece, I realized that especially the second, the adagio that opens that precedes the final movement, that actually resembles the descriptions of Beethoven's improvisations. Beethoven was a noted improviser, actually, just from what people wrote about him, perhaps the greatest in history. That people said that hearing him just improvise out of his head was almost more of an incredible shattering experience than hearing the finished works. There was so much that he could communicate that way. And in that, it's almost like there's this, Beethoven almost plays, in the opening of that movement, it's almost like there's just little fragments of whatever comes to his head, not anything that's big, and it sort of gradually coalesces into something much more intense and concentrated. And one can almost hear him sort of feeling his way, almost in a way, almost feeling his way into his new style. And something like the Opus 109 is kind of like a sort of fully realized manifestation of that. One interesting idea that I often feel like when I play these early pieces of his late period is one can hear, at least I have a feeling as a pianist, that he stopped playing the piano. His deafness enveloped him entirely. His last public performance as a pianist was actually in 1814, and by contemporary accounts, it went quite badly. They said he couldn't hear what he was doing, and when he played softly, none of the notes came out, and when he played loudly, the piano shook. He was trying to play so loudly to hear it. And it looked like maybe he just stopped playing for a while, because under the hand, they feel different than all of his earlier music. The other music has this visceral feel, like this makes sense on the piano. And every note is playable and makes sense in these pieces, except that it just doesn't feel like he tried it through on the piano. The interaction between the cello and the piano is really wonderful in these pieces. These are his really mature sonatas, and as I say, there's a wonderful sense of sort of counterpoint and interchange in these pieces. A wonderful intricacy. To take this up again and cause technical difficulties, perhaps. Hope everyone can hear me. I just had one important point I wanted to make about this piece, and it's another thing that shows up in Beethoven's late style, is there's an incredible sense of humor to it. And the last movement has this wit and sparkle, and it's just, funny in places. Almost like he had gone through life, he realized things were sort of, in some ways, the only way to get through everything is just see the absurd in everything and be humorous. And he's really having a good time with some of the I won't say ridiculous, but like playing with the conventions of what you expect. As I say, it's a wonderfully witty and at times very, very funny movement.
Thank you. Jonathan Salmon, Mark Salmon, Beethoven's Fourth Cello Sonata. Thank you. So the last and third candidate for Beethoven's beloved, the receiver of these beautiful love letters, is Bettina Brentano, whom we see here. Now, we heard about her half-sister, Antonie Brentano, who was, Bettina was the half-sister to Antonie Brentano's husband. Let me say that again. It took me a while to figure out the relationship with all these Brentanos. Bettina was the half-sister to Antonie's husband. And the Brentano family was quite a well-known literary family, poets, writers, and publishers. She herself was a gifted pianist and remained a close confidant to Beethoven. Later, mainly because of her liberal political ideas, she left Vienna and moved to Weimar, Germany, where she became closely involved with Johann von Goethe, the great German poet of the early 19th century. All three candidates for Beethoven's beloved were strong, educated, independent, and liberal-thinking women, but way above his class. Beethoven would never marry, would never have children. And he probably realized this fate and accepted these women's devotion and friendship that saw him through much of this late period of life. The final and last piece tonight is the last solo piano sonata of Beethoven. This is number 32. Opus 111, written in 1822, dedicated to Archduke Rudolph, who was an amateur pianist and composer himself, was very loyal to Beethoven and supporting him throughout all his life. Beethoven was not exactly the easiest person to deal with, and many times would make up excuses not to have to come and give lessons to Archduke Rudolph. But the money did remain and saw Beethoven to the end of his years. This last movement, the Ariata, is the second movement of this sonata. There's only 2 movements in the sonata. And don't be fooled, it is not a short piece. I think when you hear this last movement, you'll come away with the impression I have that there's like these jazz-like rhythmic syncopations in this movement. Even Winston Marsalis has made this same observation. It's all there, from ragtime to Dixieland jazz, swing to bebop, even Coltrane. So Mark, if you could please come up and play for us 32nd Sonata, Beethoven, Opus 111, written in 1822. Thank you.
I can just give a little bit more perspective on this last of Beethoven's 32 sonatas. First, I have to kind of tell you what happens in the first movement, which we don't have time for today. But the first movement is in C minor, and one of Beethoven's typical sort of C minor struggle kind of movements, heroic and full of energy and that feeling of, it's almost like a throwback to sort of like his middle period in a way, even though it has many of the characteristics of the late period. It has that sort of terseness and improvisatory opening section and a sort of contrapuntal, very fugal development section. Interestingly, the first movement ends, though, in a very open-ended way. It ends in C major. C major doesn't, certainly shows up in the course of the movement, but we certainly don't have any feeling that this is where the sonata is going to go. I mean, very often, pieces might end in C major, but it almost has this sense of resolution. But when Beethoven ends this piece in C major, he does it in such a way it feels like, oh, it's opening up a new world that we haven't explored yet. And an interesting thing about this, often with Beethoven, the works that he wrote in similar keys often had they dealt with sort of similar, maybe philosophical issues. And all of his C minor pieces, again, have that struggle. Some of them end triumphantly and heroically in C major. But there's one sonata in particular, a very early sonata, the 5th one, the Opus 10, number 1, where the entire 3 movements of the sonata, finally at the very end, you get this sort of slightly open-ended C major ending. But the piece ends, and it almost seems a little bit inconclusive. And what I sort of feel like is the ending of the first movement of this sonata is very, very similar, of the first movement is similar to that entire early sonata. And it's almost like Beethoven had to wait 30 years before he actually knew what he could compose after that open-ended C major ending. And the second movement is as diametrically opposed to the first as you possibly could get. Early critics were even disturbed by how disparate the styles are. But of course, nothing could come after that first movement except for this sort of incredibly ethereal, introspective, inward, celestial kind of set of variations. Not dissimilar in its concept to the Opus 109 third movement that we heard before, in that it starts with a very, very slow, beautiful, inward-feeling arietta. And gradually, each variation explores something that is innate in that little arietta. And as Michael's saying, each variation gets faster and faster till we end up with that almost jazzy-sounding one. And after that sort of very, very joyous, incredibly energetic outburst, the music becomes totally inward and turns in on itself and almost goes, I don't know, looking at the depths that are inside of everyone rather than looking externally. And the second half of the variations is all about that. And at the very ending of the sonata, there's almost this feeling that, oh, Beethoven is taking sort of a leave of the sonata form. It is his last one. He really wasn't interested in writing sonatas for the piano anymore. The rest of his life he spent mostly finishing the Missa Solemnis and the Ninth Symphony and the late string quartets. I think he really did feel that he had said all that he wanted to say on the piano, and he was dissatisfied with the instrument because it wasn't powerful enough for him. Another aside is probably the reason why we have the instrument today. In some ways, it's because of all of Beethoven's sonatas. He wrote pieces that the instruments couldn't quite handle and couldn't express anything in them, and then pianists demanded of the instrument makers to kind of build a more robust instrument. So in many ways, that was what set like the evolution of the modern piano in motion. Anyway, it's really one of the great works in all the piano literature.
takes your breath away, doesn't it? What a phenomenal, phenomenal piece. Thank you, thank you. Here we see Beethoven's last apartment in Vienna in 1827 when he died from numerous ailments. It was in this room that many of his late great works were composed. Beethoven's death marks the end of the classical music period that started in the late 18th century. Yet Beethoven's late works certainly lay the foundation for the 19th century Romantic movement, influencing Chopin to Debussy, from Wagner to Verdi, from Brahms to Tchaikovsky, even to 20th century American jazz. By the way, when Beethoven died, his late works were considered basically unplayable, including the Ninth Symphony, the late piano sonatas, and especially his last string quartet, the Great Fugue, Grosse Fuge. It wasn't until some 10 years after Beethoven's death that a young pianist, Franz Liszt, would perform the Great Hammerklavier Sonata in its first public performance. This is a painting of Beethoven's funeral cortege, which was the largest public gathering in the history of Vienna up to 1827. One of the pallbearers was Franz Schubert, a then unknown composer who would die the next year at the age of 31. Beethoven left a legacy of over 660 compositions, published 138 opuses during his lifetime, over half of them composed when he was deaf or nearly deaf. It is uncanny that in our Annus Horribilis of 2020 coincides with the 250th anniversary of Beethoven's birth. His perseverance to pursue his art despite his deafness, depression, and isolation is our inspiration to overcome the ravages of this pandemic and plan ahead for recovery, and especially to once again attend live performances. Thank you, Mark, thank you, Jonathan, and thank you, Sarah, for turning pages, for a wonderful, wonderful evening and afternoon of music. And thank you to our virtual audience for joining us today. Have a good evening. Thank you, and goodbye.